Well, hey, I'm Dave Plummer, retired software engineer from Microsoft, going back to the MS-DOS and Windows 95 days. Today I'm going to take you on a 40-year coding journey that starts with riding my bike down to Radio Shack, progresses on through Microsoft and shipping multiple versions of MS-DOS and Windows, and ultimately finds me on YouTube with about 500,000 subscribers. But first I'd like to thank my host, Bill Hurd, wherever he is. We still haven't met. For inviting me, because it's awfully rare to get a chance to talk to a bunch of retro computer enthusiasts live, and so I very much appreciate the opportunity. And come to think of it, it's actually only the second time that I've ever spoken in public outside of weddings and funerals, so I hope you'll be patient with me. I'm used to being able to edit out my mistakes in post, and you only see me from there up, and you don't see what I do with my hands. But at some point, the odds are that you've run some of my code, and that's because I was an early employee at Microsoft, where I worked on every operating system from MS-DOS on through XP and Server 2003. I also contributed to the OLE code base for the Mac, and if you count a trivial contribution to the Linux kernel many decades ago, then I guess the odds are you've been living the Dave Payall life all along without even knowing it. I started in MS-DOS in 1993, and I spent a little more than a decade at Microsoft, leaving after Server 2003. Back in the days when software came on those little plastic coasters, my fingerprints were on most of them. I've already had the Windows 95 20th year reunion and the Windows NT 25th, and I was going to make a reference to going back to meet up with the old gray-bearded programmers until I realized I literally am one of them too now. I was born back in 1968, and the custom at the time seemed to be that all boys should be named Robert, Michael, or David, and so my parents picked the latter, and so David it is. I'm fourth generation family hardware store. My dad owned and operated a store called Plummer's Hardware back in my hometown of Regina, Saskatchewan. Woo. The store was just down the alley from our house, and my grandpa's workshop was right next door to that, and so every day from the age of about 5 on up, I would head on down, especially in the summers, and hang out with my dad at the hardware store for a while, and then visit my grandfather at his shop. He was what you would call a maker long before there was such a thing. He was always making inventions and wiring up odd things like light bulbs that activated in his noisy shop when the phone rang, and he had a complete injection plastic molding the big hydraulic system in his basement to produce a style of plumbing check valve that he'd invented. And the fact that a guy named Plummer invented a plumbing check valve is called an aptronym, and now we all know what an aptronym is. Not only did his shop feature a Coke machine, but he had the key. And sometimes he'd open it up and grab us each a bottle. As a little kid, being able to open up the Coke machine to me seemed to be the ultimate in power and privilege. It was also my first experience with anything that felt like hacking, and bypassing the coin mechanism on the Coke machine somehow made the Coke taste all the better. And between Grandpa's hardware store and my dad's hardware store and my grandpa's shop, I spent a great deal of time just hanging around with people that were always busy fixing, inventing, and building things. And I think that was somehow formative. And of course, what was hardware for them would turn out to be software for me, but some of the core instincts are very similar, I think. Several years later, when I was able to venture a little further from home, I made my way into the local Radio Shack store. And there, still fresh in a pile of boxes, sat something I'd only ever heard of on TV, a computer. The TRS-80 Model 1 Level 1 with 4K. When I asked when it was going to be ready to see, they said, well, they weren't sure how to hook it up yet. So in a movie that would become somewhat of a theme in my life, I offered that, I'll go ahead and do it for you, even though I clearly had no idea what I was doing. They must have felt I was precocious enough to humor with their expensive system, because they said, sure, kid, have a shot, and they left me to it. Now, in all honesty, it wasn't that much different from hooking up a component stereo of the day, except Tandy, in their infinite wisdom, used the exact same round 5-pin DIN connector for video, power, and keyboard. But I still managed somehow not to blow it up. It was going to be my first experience with dust blinking lights, and I loved it. The more LEDs something had, as far as I was concerned, the better. Once it was up and running, I naively performed a Turing test on the machine by typing English commands into the BASIC interpreter. Let's just say that Level 1 BASIC, especially on the TRS-80, was not ChatGPT. It failed miserably and just responded with SN ? Which I kept assuming meant spelling error. Later on, I would figure out it was a syntax error, but at that age, I didn't know what syntax was anyway, so it didn't matter. I didn't get very far that first day, but I rode or rode my bike down there every Thursday night and Saturday morning, and the manager, Brian Patmore, let me key in the basic programs that I had dreamed up in elementary school in the days prior. I didn't even save any of these early programs to cassette and keyed in something pretty much new every time. I initially had no idea how limited the basic interpreter actually was, but I learned pretty quickly. Unfortunately, there were no books on how a kid could learn Z80 assembly language, or Z80 as we called it, at least not that I could find in my town. And while the Radio Shack guys were friendly, initially they knew less about the machines than I did, so as gracious as they were about letting me exploit Regina's Thursday night shopping policy, I couldn't spend all my days sitting on a stool in the corner of a retail store. And about that time, I discovered the computer lab at the University of Regina. I found a convenient shortcut through the park and found that I could take my bike to the university in just about 10 minutes. And there, on the first floor of the building, was Minerva, or Venerva, or maybe they had both, but either way, they had a PDP 1140, and I had discovered that on Saturday morning, kids were tolerated. Or at least, I just acted like I was supposed to be there, and they didn't kick me out, so it was a good arrangement. The PDP had the most lights of all, and the hello prompt of what I think was likely RSTS awaited. Soon my mom looked into it a little further for me and found there was actually a class you could take in that very lab, on that very machine, and the public was welcome. So within a couple of weeks, I was pretty proficient on a Decorator 110, knew what to do at a PDP 11 login prompt, and even had my own account where I could save and retrieve my programs. So I used that knowledge to continue coming in on Saturdays to tinker while the summer lasted. Because they were so new and rare, access to computers, at least for me, would be scarce for a while. Prices would come down over time, but my family just didn't have the thousands of spare dollars it still took in those days. So I would continue to rent, borrow, or beg whatever computer time I could get. And as much as we might disdain the basic language, at least it's reasonably portable, especially if you're going from, one Microsoft interpreter to another. But even if you wound up in, say, Apple Basic, you weren't completely lost. So these little basic masterpieces that you dreamt up could be adapted to wherever you could get access. And then after renting a VIC-20 from the public library for a couple of weeks, my parents surprised me with the news that we would be getting a Commodore 64. I don't think it was anywhere within the family budget, but even being a big stretch for them, they were going out on a limb. I wasn't especially familiar with that computer going in, but in retrospect, it was probably the best possible choice for me. And it was literally the last thing that anybody's ever bought for me, because everything else I own stems from that 64. Ultimately, I would use it enough to earn a C-128 and then an Amiga eventually, and that's where I wrote the software that would put me through college to get me the job at Microsoft, and it all stems from that Commodore 64 connected to our little 12-inch Zenith TV. The 64 came with a machine language monitor that allowed me to get my feet wet. In those days, a quick test of how fast the computer was to increment the screen color register in a loop as fast as you could and just see what it looked like. In the basic interpreter, you'd get a rapid flashing of the whole screen, but in machine code, it was different. The electron beam on the screen barely advanced an inch across the scan line before the color changed. You could see the speed, and it was intoxicating. Did I just say that a 1 megahertz machine was intoxicating? Well, it really was, because the leap in speed and power from basic to assembly language was several orders of magnitude, not just one. So, armed with the Commodore 64 Programmer's Reference Manual and a pad of graph paper, I set out to revolutionize the video game industry. In truth, I wrote something similar to Galaga, but with far fewer attackers. And by this time, I was smart enough to save my programs. And this was important enough that I was even going to make a backup, except I screwed up. Floppies didn't come pre-formatted in those days, and somehow I managed to get my disk backwards, and I formatted the original. I'm still a little bitter about that one to this day, but ironically, in truth, at least the way I'm wired, that moment is now so burned into my brain that I have a pretty good mental image of what the game looked like anyway, better than if I would have saved it. You'll notice that I've been saying machine language and not assembly language, and at first it truly was, because the C64 monitor that I was using didn't have an assembler built in yet. And it certainly didn't have labels or line numbers, so if you wanted to insert an instruction, because 6502 is non-relocatable, you can't just move it, you'd have to jump out to free memory, do your work there, and then jump back to where you were. It was the true definition of spaghetti code, something you don't hear much about these days, but it was a real thing on early projects written in unstructured languages. The year I turned 16, I finally met a kindred soul who was doing the same thing as me, whiling away the long summer months in his mother's basement writing Commodore 64 assembly language. His name was Chris, and he knew a lot more than me, so I spent the rest of the summer standing over his shoulder, watching him code, and I learned by observation. He'd written the game Frantic Freddy, and we would go on to write, or he would go on to write games like Test Drive 2 for the 64 as well. And he actually lived across the street from me, but it was a really busy street and I wasn't allowed to cross it, so it had to wait till I was driving age. As a bit of an aside, at the time I had just failed my driving test, mostly for lack of practice. So with Chris being a couple of years older, I suggested that he could supervise me on my learner's permit. And my mom agreed to this, so while on paper Chris taught me to drive, the reality is that he had never had a driver's license either. And so that weird symbiotic relationship was kind of emblematic of how we learned to code as well. In high school, about the only class that I truly enjoyed was computer science, and I was fortunate to have a dedicated computer science instructor in the aptly named Mr. Bright, who was not only a great teacher in general, but also a knowledgeable computer enthusiast in particular. Not unlike a Microsoft interview question, the assignments he came up with for us often had a trivial answer that could then be vastly improved. For example, one assignment was to find all the prime numbers up to 1,000. If it worked, great, you passed. But to get a great mark, it had to be fast too. So just as you see some kids training for football for hours after school to be the fastest, Mr. Bright would keep the lab open for us and we'd hang around and optimize our prime sieves. By late high school, though, I had sort of drifted away from computers for a year or two as I worried about cars and girls and whatever else that teenage boys care about. Now, you'll notice I didn't say I was particularly worried about school, which I was not. In fact, at some point in 12th grade, I just stopped going. My kids will still ask me today, how did you drop out of high school? Wasn't that a huge decision? Why did your mom even let you? And it turns out that dropping out of high school is one of those things that happens slowly and inexorably, not overnight. You miss a class here and a test there, and pretty soon you're staring down a shiny blade at 7-Eleven at 4 a.m. And that's when the call that saved me came out of the blue. I'd been drifting through life for the last year or two, not in school, working in warehouses and retail, and I had no grand plan. That's when I got a call from John, someone I'd gone to school with and who was also a couple of years my senior, and he was a true computer savant. He had gone to my high school where he was well known as a super genius. I'm literally still doing the odd project that I saw John do on 8-bit computers in the 90s because he really was that gifted. He did 3D printed rotations of the space shuttle using the Commodore MPS, one character redefinable font, and just crazy stuff. And now he was working for a big video game company in Ottawa, and they were desperate for good programmers, and did I know anything about the Commodore 64? When they asked if I could handle video interrupts and multiplexed sprite hardware, I confirmed that I was indeed well-versed in such topics, which is really my way of saying, I'll figure that out before I get there. And I've done that too many times to count. So I'd watched Chris do similar tasks, and I knew what the general idea was and how it worked, so I sat up late into the night and got a rough demo up and running on the 64. This was long before the internet, so I wound up making a VHS demo tape of the video output of the 64, and the next morning overnighted that to Ottawa so I could await their judgment, which was that I should load all of my belongings into the trunk of my 1969 Pontiac and head east if we could only agree on a dollar amount. I could tell they were desperate, so I really reached for it. I told them I would need at least $6,000 over the course of 4 months to write the game, and that works out to $9 an hour. Sounded like a lot of money at the time, though. I moved into John's attic in Ottawa, and basically we lived at work anyway, cranking out the game code in 6502 assembly. And then when I returned to Regina, Chris and I set up a small video game studio in the offices of a wicker furniture warehouse in the industrial area, and we contracted out to companies like Electronic Arts and Accolade. Eventually, I was making decent money under my new contracts, and things were looking up, except I still hadn't even finished high school. So, long story short, I headed down to the local high school at the age of 21 and demanded that they let me in. I had an answer for every objection they were able to raise, and eventually they relented. If you've not done anything fun for a while, I totally recommend going back to high school in your early 20s. But then, is it even ethically valid to date a high school senior? And all you have to ask her is we've been married 30 years next spring. And so 7 years into high school, I finally qualified for the restricted adult entry program at the local U of R. Meanwhile, back at home, by this point in the 80s, I had an Amiga, not a PC. In fact, I wouldn't even own a PC before I worked for Microsoft, other than an old key-start Philips 286 that I literally salvaged out of my father-in-law's dumpster to learn Excel on. I really enjoyed the 68,000 instruction set, as it reminded me of the PDP-11 in a way. And it was still made for humans to code in, unlike the chips of later years where they're really designed for the compilers and not the coders. I was working my way through the U of R, so on the side, I started to write an app for the Amiga. I knew it wasn't a big market by any stretch, however, so I decided to go commercial from the start rather than shareware. My first success was a program called Hypercash. The Amiga operating system, while advanced in the sense that it supported multitasking and similar features long before they became commonplace, completely lacked disk caching. And it turned out the difference with and without my software on the machine was pretty much night and day, and so it became quite popular. Now, by popular, I mean it paid my way through school, but I was still driving a rusty 75 Monte Carlo. So hundreds and then thousands of copies, but never like millions. I drew up the cover art in Corel Paint, and we had the manuals produced at the school's print shop. And so each day after school, I'd head home with a bundle of Hypercash under my arm, and on the days I couldn't make it, my girlfriend, now wife, could be found shrink-wrapping software in between her own classes. During my second to last summer in college, I was working at the local phone company and not really enjoying it. I still didn't know what I was going to do for a living ultimately. And while I knew it had to be programming, I didn't know if it was going to be embedded microwave oven code or video games, or I had no idea. Each day at lunch, I'd eat in the food court with the old and the bored and read a book. On one occasion, I wandered into the bookstore and grabbed a copy of the book Hard Drive, Bill Gates and the Making of Microsoft. As an Amiga enthusiast, Microsoft was always kind of the enemy to me, but I was still interested in learning more about them and the story behind them. And once I got into the book, interested is not the word I'd use to best describe it. Enthralled, perhaps, or entranced. I don't actually know, but for certain, I was fascinated by the people and the projects and the environment and how they got things done. I knew immediately and with great certainty where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do with my life. The only problem, however, was that I was sitting in a Saskatchewan food court, and Microsoft was at the time receiving over 100,000 job applications a year. They did recruit a bit out of Waterloo and Eastern Canada, but suffice to say the U of R was not on their radar at the time. The odds of even getting an application noticed seemed very remote, so what to do? Well, my Hypercash program, like most software packages of that day, came with a little registration card that you could fill out and mail in so that I could notify you of updates and upgrades and so on. I would come home after school and type in the stack that arrived into the mail into a little database that I'd written. Fortunately, even though it was barely 1990, I had included an email field on the form. So I went through digging for anybody that I could find that had a Microsoft email address. I found one or two or maybe three, but one fellow responded, Alistair Banks. I asked him where or to whom I should send a resume to maximize the chance of it being seen, and he gave me the greatest gift that you can give to an aspiring graduate, the contact emails of a few managers that were actively hiring new developers. So I put together my resume and fired it off directly to them. Within a few weeks, I had a phone interview with Ben Slivka, who ran the MS-DOS development team and who would later start the Internet Explorer project. Although he did the phone screen with me, and Microsoft keeps them pretty technically demanding, you don't have to code live on the phone, so I could hide my lack of x86 specific experience to some extent. I managed to net an interview loop in Redmond in February, and Microsoft, to its great credit, takes care of everything. You just show up. Their legal department does the visa work, for example, and they make all the travel arrangements, although they assumed that being Canadian, I would fly through Toronto because all Canadians fly through Toronto. Microsoft interview loops used to be famously grueling. You spend the entire day there. You start with an HR interview to make sure you're sane and bathed, and if so, you're off then to a series of 5 one-hour coding interviews where you stand at a whiteboard and answer brain teasers and write C or assembly code until you can't go any further. They push you until they stump you or break you, and depending on how those first 5 go, you might then make it to the as-appropriate interview, which is, of course, the hiring manager. And the answer is Boolean at each of the steps, hire or no hire. There's no, well, he's pretty good, maybe. So there are no maybes. You only get to the final interview if pretty much everybody else has said hire. Since the whole team has to be bought in on who gets hired, it's not just up to the boss. The coding problems are simple tasks that you can fit onto a whiteboard, like how to reverse a linked list, or how to count the number of bits that are set in a word, attempt to factor a prime number, that sort of thing, where there's an obvious and trivial approach that can then be refined and optimized. You want to see their thought process and what they consider to be good enough. Take the case of Max. Take the case of counting the number of bits that are set in a 32-bit word. The naive approach is to OR it with 1, increment it if true, shift the word, and then repeat. Do that 32 times, and you've got your answer. But that can be improved because you can stop as soon as the remaining word is 0, right? And as the interviewer, you watch to see if the person picks up on those little optimizations as they chew on the problem. But What about long runs of zeros separated by ones? Well, you'd be wasting a lot of time checking all the zeros in between, but it turns out that instead of ANDing with 1, you AND with the number itself less 1, which clears each bit as you go. So if there's only 3 bits set, you're only doing 3 operations. In other words, there's a simple answer, the fast answer, and then the smart enough to get yourself hired answer. I learned quickly that I'd made it, and right after final exams finished at school, I flew on down. Excuse me. After a couple of hours of new intern orientation, they gave me an office, an account, and a copy of the MASM assembler. And then from there, it's sink or swim. Because remember, it's still 1993. There's no World Wide Web, there's no Google or Wikipedia or Stack Overflow or anywhere to look anything up. I've never written a line of x86 code before, and they're expecting me to be productive immediately. Excuse me. So I'm sitting in an office with a desk, a chair, a used PC, a network cable, and that's all you get. And I can't overstress the straight into the fire part. It's not like the phone company where they give the interns some token task that they can't screw up and won't cause a problem when they inevitably do anyway. In contrast, Microsoft has me working on the core code base for new features for MS-DOS, which is technically a multi-billion-dollar business. Bill Gates has us over to his house to talk about it over a few beers, and I'm supposed to act like this is all normal for me. They take their interns pretty seriously, or at least they did in the day. And there are only perhaps 5 or 6 developers in total on MS-DOS, and most of them are feverishly working on the compression engine to not use a hash table, since the Stack Corporation managed to somehow get a patent on that, using a hash table in compression, and Microsoft lost a lawsuit, so they had to rewrite it. So it's me and one other intern developer responsible for pretty much every new feature in the operating system, including the new setup program. To ease into things at least a little, my first task was to make disk copy single pass. Because at least it's a standalone app that I can assemble and build and something that I can get my head around and tinker with and kind of learn what I'm doing. The prior implementation had been limited to base RAM only, and so it took many, many swaps for like the first 5 versions of DOS to complete a single disk copy. The hardest part is actually finding a safe place to store a temporary copy of the floppy disk when there are a million different possible system configurations. Because remember, if you accidentally store a temporary file on a metered network share, it's probably a class action lawsuit. And if you assume that the C drive is the hard drive, perhaps you crash a helicopter, ATM, defibrillator, or who knows what. And so that's the biggest trick to coding for a billion machines. You're basically coding one bull in a lab to be released into an infinite number of China shops that you've never seen any of them before. So if anything can break anywhere, it will somewhere. It's truly a different approach to the philosophy of coding, I think. My next task was to limit the RAM use of the double-space compression program. As you might remember, memory back then was limited to 640K on MS-DOS, and so everything you could move above that barrier meant more free memory for useful things like your applications. And the x86 has an interesting, I don't know if it's a feature or a bug, I think it's a feature, but your segment and offset registers can add up to just more than 1 megabyte. Basically, your pointer wraps around to the start of memory again, sometimes. It depends on whether the A20 keyboard line is high or not. If the A20 line is high, then the pointer wraps around back to low memory. If the A20 line is left low, then they point up past the 1 megabyte boundary. Now I use this kind of hackery to move the engine up into code above 1 megabyte and then stub every function call to do this crazy pointer math and exploit the CPU feature, which allowed me to free up all of the code from low memory. And that's the kind of thing that actually got magazine cover stories back in those days. Next was the attempt to save money by putting the upgrade on a single floppy disk. Well, MS-DOS 6.2 might ship on 4 or 5 disks. What if you already had MS-DOS 6.0? So what I did was to write an upgrade system that patched the 6.0 binaries in place with deltas to make them into 6.2 binaries, and discovered that all of those deltas combined were still small enough to fit on a single floppy. And so we were able to offer the MS-DOS 6.22 step-up upgrade on a single floppy, saving several dollars per copy, which if you multiply by tens of millions of copies. A single little project by an intern therefore generated millions in savings, showing that even interns can have a real impact. But after that, to me anyway, it felt like the real work began. Because of my experience with Hypercash, they appointed me to write the smart drive cache engine to be more generic and support all kinds of block-level devices, like the CD-ROMs that were just coming on the marketplace. Caching made an epic performance difference on CDs. All of this work took only 3 months, and I still have trouble believing that when I look back at it, because if I had to schedule that amount of work for myself now, I'd say a year easy, but it's amazing what you can accomplish when you're young, broke, and hungry. Even though I felt I had done a good job, there was no guarantee that an internship would ever translate into any kind of full-time position. So when my summer was over, I came back to Regina to go back to class and hoped that the phone might ring one day. And I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when that call came in that fall. I was being offered a full-time software design engineer position in Redmond, complete with relocation benefits, visa, immigration assistance, the works. And the salary, you ready? You've all heard of the Microsoft millions of that era. No, it was $35,000 a year. That's all they were paying, but I didn't care. I didn't negotiate. Whatever it was enough. I wasn't really in it for the money, even if I told myself I was at the time. It wasn't really until the UPS drivers went on strike shortly after that I found out they were making 50% more than I was. But I didn't really care, and there were these other things called stock options that worked out okay in the end, so. What I found especially interesting was to compare notes with the other new hires from places like MIT and Harvard and Princeton. They got the exact same offer I did, right down to the penny. I don't know what it cost to go to Harvard, but I bet you could save 15% or more by switching to the U of R. Microsoft again suggested that when I fly down, I again go through Toronto, but this was because they were having trouble in Vancouver because too many Canadians had been coming down to work for Microsoft kind of all of a sudden, and they were starting to push back hard on the visas. So Toronto being a little silly, we agreed on Calgary. My fiance and I flew in, and I got taken into the big glass room for my immigration interview. As she watched from the outside, she could see him flailing his arms and turning red in the face and yelling. Clearly, I was headed back to Canada, and my Microsoft dreams were not to be. But what she didn't know, because she couldn't hear anything, was that he had already long since stamped and approved my work visa. He was upset because every time he printed a document in Word, it would print a blank piece of paper at the end. And since I was going to work for Microsoft, he wanted me to fix it for him. So I showed him how to tweak his margins or the borders of the border, and I was released on my way. That May, I flew back one weekend. I convocated from the U of R on Friday, got married on Saturday, and then permanently relocated to the US on Monday. And by the way, if any of you are planning a wedding, I strongly endorse the approach of hiding out in another country while all the hard decisions are made for you. Then you just fly in, do it, fly out. Bye. Truly hassle-free. As to the rest of my career, other than that internship in MS-DOS, I had managed to dodge the x86's ugly 16-bit segmented mode almost entirely, while the 16-bit guys were, oh, there's DOS. There's the immigration guy. We're a little behind. There's Dave Cutler. We were working, well, this is while the 16-bit guys were working on Windows 95 and Windows 98 on the other side of campus, we saw ourselves as the real programmers working under Dave Cutler, who had just finished the VMS operating system in perfect hand-coded assembly language, and we produced the real code in our minds. It was in pure C and for multiple platforms. In a somewhat ironic turn, I still didn't have a PC as my main machine because I was assigned the job of porting the Win95 user interface over to the RISC chips, so I actually had a MIPS R4000 dual processor machine workstation instead. Working at Microsoft before and after my final semester of school led to something that I think was entertaining, at least for me, but it might have been a source of annoyance for my professors, because I had run off during my fourth year to write major portions of the world's most popular operating system. I guess it's perhaps somewhat fitting that my work on MS-DOS came in between the introduction to operating systems and the advanced operating systems classes. If nothing else, if I wasn't the only guy in the class with a published OS under his belt, at least mine was probably the best selling. I spent the majority of my career on Windows NT, which became Windows XP and is today Windows 11. Most of the code lives on. I continued to write projects at home as well, which I'd sell as shareware. I had an agreement with Microsoft because I had already done a bunch of shareware before, so they were like, cool, as long as it's not competitive with us or your day job. One such example was a product called Visual Zip that let you treat compressed zip archives as if they were regular directories, browsing down inside them and so on. I was selling maybe a dozen copies a day when I received a call early one morning from Microsoft who was interested in purchasing Visual Zip for inclusion in the operating system, and would I be interested in coming in to talk about it? Yeah, spit take. Excuse me. I hadn't left for work yet, so I asked her where her office was so that I could stop on by, and she kind of got nervous. And this led to some awkward confusion until we finally realized that the person I was dealing with didn't know that I worked at Microsoft. They had just cold called the author of the software to talk about it, who happened to be me at home. So we came to an agreement where Microsoft purchased Visual Zip from me and included it in the operating system. I'll abbreviate a long and complicated story to just say that when your options are take the deal or quit your day job and compete with Microsoft on your own, you tend to take the deal. The Windows Task Manager that you've no doubt seen also began that way, as it was a shareware app that I started in my den and that I was planning to sell on the side, but when Dave C. saw it, he agreed to let me check it into the product. So I basically donated that one to the cause. But surprisingly, both Visual Zip and Task Manager are still both alive and well in the product almost 30 years later. A large part of my early work was to take all of the code that was coming out of the Windows 95 and Windows 98 projects and rewrite them for NT. And that meant taking code intended for an x86 processor running 8-bit ANSI text in the home and then making it ready for server-level quality on a RISC machine with 16-bit Unicode text. And because char and byte are used almost interchangeably by most C programmers, it really means that you're changing the assumption about how big a character is, and it becomes 16 bits, and almost all code breaks immediately. There were just dozens of other issues as well, like they assumed a broadcast-style network with immediate timeouts, where we were on TCP/IP with long timeouts. And so many things became an architectural rewrite. Of course, on our behalf, we were immune from and protected from the realities of being forced to be compatible with a million random software titles going back into the 70s, not to mention operating with a lot fewer system resources, as they had to run in, I think, 4 megabytes. And so you can imagine when your job is to take somebody else's code, tell them why it sucks, fix it for them, and give it back to them, which is what we did day after day, week after month. Some tensions could develop between those teams. And then they merged those teams, which, as you can imagine, didn't go well. So I wound up moving over to head up the copy protection team. Yes, it's true. I am the evil monster responsible for making you enter a product key in order to activate Windows. Or at least, I'm the guy that's responsible for making sure that the same key isn't used by 2 people in the universe at any one time. There's 2 major tensions in such copy protection. You can't annoy the users, at least not any more than the bare minimum required. And you can't let normal, everyday people just abusively steal the product. But the worst case to me is annoying regular users without really slowing down the real pirates at all. I still can't go into all the cool technical details of self-modifying code that decrypts itself on the fly and all of that, because I suppose it's probably still trade secret. But suffice to say, I think it was almost 18 months before a usable crack for XP actually hit the web. So in my mind, the protection was a great success. And if you're keeping track, that original XP key protection was finally broken this spring after some 25 years. On the side, I had been selling 3 small performance utilities for Windows, MemTurbo, NetTurbo, and a clipboard program called ClipTracker. One day, I might be sending out 24 mailers, making a few extra $100 that day. And then one day, I discovered internet advertising. This was in the Wild West days of pop-ups and such, no less. I was by no means the first, but my ads were fairly effective. Now, when you're selling software on the internet, your 2 basic fundamental metrics are how much did it cost me in terms of advertising and so on to sell the product, and how much did I earn? And computers are great about tracking and optimizing those details. And in those very early days, when everybody was new to it, I found that it cost about $10 in advertising to sell a $50 product for a net profit of $40. And you would just rinse and repeat as fast as you could. And so I bought millions of advertising impressions that ultimately became billions of impressions over time. My problem was that now, overnight, I was selling 1,000 copies a day. Sounds great, and it was great, but I had to come home after work to duplicate 1,000 floppies. Then I had to print 1,000 mailers and 1,000 disk labels, and I had to put them on and get them assembled. And there would always be about 2,500 emails to answer and probably 50 returns to process, and it was just me and my wife. And so I had 2 kids and a dog and a rather demanding day job on the side, so we hired friends and family to come in and put stickers on disks and answer email as fast as we could until we eventually got caught up. All of this was making it rather hard to pay attention to my day job, but Microsoft was great about it, and they allowed me to take a 3-month leave of absence to figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life. And it turned out that what I really wanted to do, at least at that age, like a lot of people, was just to make a lot of money and be my own boss. And as a result, I turned my back on everything that I had come to love about my day job in order to focus on my side business, which was now the main business. Running your own busy software business is fun and exciting, and I had a great time doing it. I hand-wired every office for Cat5 and hand-terminated every cable by myself because I like things just so. But in reality, I'd already worked once for the world's biggest software company, and I wasn't really interested in just trying to build a little clone of them. And so, to be honest, when I was pedaling my bike down to Radio Shack on those Saturday mornings as a kid, it was not because I wanted to manage a productive group of other kids. I wanted to program, to code, to figure stuff out, and to write hard logic that would impress myself and my friends. And that's how I wanted to spend my days too, not with customers and program managers and lawyers. So I ultimately sold the company to Support.com and have been unofficially retired ever since. There's a great book, it's several years old now, but I recommend it, called Showstopper, about the early development of Windows NT. In one section in it, they discuss a conversation between a friend of mine, Bob Day, and his wife when they were talking about what Bob Day really likes to do with his time. Well, Bob likes to code. Well, there must be something else Bob enjoys, right? Cars, sports, science fiction maybe? Well, Bob likes to code, and that's what Bob does all day too. And that's what I do as well. I just love to code. So sure, I get to spend more time with my family, and I've traveled a little bit, but mostly retiring has meant that I get to write as much code as I want. To be fair, though, I also spend a lot of time restoring antique cars. I undertake a lot of mechanical projects like solar panels for my shop or my microcontroller-controlled 1,500 horsepower twin-turbo fuel-injected intercooled big block that I built from cheap eBay parts. So I actually alternate. I code obsessively until I need to take a break, and then I undertake some other project just as obsessively in another discipline, usually mechanical, until I miss coding and go back to coding again. A recent project of mine was to build a cool LED spectrum analyzer. Back in high school, John had built one out of discrete components like filters and op amps, and there was an entire daughter board assembled on top of the motherboard inside of his PET 2001. But I was going to use a modern microcontroller, and I wanted to do it all on one chip. The ESP32 has 2 CPU cores, and they each run at 240 megahertz, so I figured that by having one core continuously processing the FFT math while the other core is continually drawing the display. As those cores are churning away, the chip wakes up 44,000 times a second to sample the digital audio. The chip is really quite at about its limits, and I love projects that do that. It's like when you get your washing machine really working hard on a cycle. If nobody else is home, sometimes I'll still jam the lid switch open and sit back and watch the machine at work, even at the age of 54. But more about that in a moment. Now, of course, the spectrum analyzer has been done before, and it will be done again and again because it's a cool and beautiful programming project, and when you're done, you wind up with a lot of dust blinking lights. And as the more dust blinking lights in your life, the better. So that almost brings us full circle, from a childhood of tinkering to a retirement of tinkering. A few years later, I was diagnosed with autism, and while it kicked off a journey of self-discovery that has been very rewarding and helpful, at first I wasn't so sure. I was more worried that I'd be constrained or boxed in by the diagnosis. And so I undertook to do some of the things that I simply wasn't good at. They say most discoveries take place in uncharted waters, and I think this is a little different. To that end, then, I hosted an open house party for about 100 people at my shop, something that was well outside my comfort zone. Then I wrote a book, Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, which ironically has nothing to do with money and is basically everything I know now about living a successful life on the spectrum that I wish I'd known way back then. Next, I started a YouTube channel. Now, I'm one of those people who doesn't even really like having my picture taken, so editing myself in glorious 4K 60 all day is some serious desensitization therapy. But it's allowed me to continue to write several thousands of words every week and tinker with some of my favorite hobby projects. One of my favorites to date has been the Kim 1. I first decided that I really wanted a Kim 1 when I lost out on an eBay auction for a cool blue one. But a few months later, a green one appeared, and it was a rare revision A from before Commodore bought MOS, or MOS. I still don't know how to say it. I've only read it in books. It used ceramic chips, and better yet, which is it? MOS. MOS, thank you. And it was accompanied by a number of boards and a backplane that I knew nothing about. So I took a shot at the auction and made a solid offer on it before it came to a close, and the seller accepted. So that made me the proud new owner of not only a Revision A Kim 1, but also a set of MTU expansion boards in a dual chassis. They included 2 16K RAM boards, an 8K visible memory graphics board, a disk controller, an EEPROM burner, a PROM board, and an experimentation PCB. I'd hit the jackpot of Kim 1 hardware, but none of it worked out of the box. I figured it would make life simpler if I just started with the Kim 1. It had a number of mods already and intended to give it serial communications back in the day, but I wouldn't need those as I had an external board that would do that. So I spent a few days restoring the Kim 1 to as close to stock as I could get it based on the schematics. Soon enough, I had it up and running. Next, I got the RAM boards up and running, and soon enough, I even had the graphics terminal working. I was pretty excited, and I decided to film all this for a YouTube episode, so I tore it all down so that I could be able to back up step by step on camera. And that's where I made another fatal mistake. Because you see, the Kim 1 takes at least 4 different power supplies. It takes a regulated 5 volt, a regulated 12 volt, an unregulated 8 volt, and an unregulated 16 volt. And while I had carefully color-coded each of these connections, when it came time to do it for the camera, that meant reaching around back so as not to obscure the view. And long story short, I plugged a 16-volt supply into the 5-volt input and produced a great deal of smoke. I was devastated, and I'm not a hardware guy, and this was going to be a real trial by fire, almost literally. In the span of a few days, thanks in large part to a simple logic chip tester, I had the KIM-1 itself working again. The memory board and the others soon followed, but when it came to the visible memory board, it had had so much previous work that there were no traces on large parts of the board. So I spent the better part of a week trying to reconstruct it before finally admitting that it was just outside of my ability. A friend of mine connected me with a fellow named Jonathan at a shop called Glitchworks out in Vermont, and I sent the stack off to him. He may not be fast, but he's very, very good. And he completely rebuilt the problematic part of the circuit while upgrading some of the parts he didn't like the original specifications for. Once I had the KIM-1 back up and running, I did a few projects that I felt would be fun, at least for me. The first thing I did was to locate the original Microsoft source code to 6502 BASIC from 1977. Then I used the right tools to build it and produce a binary of my own. I think I used a series of utilities to convert that binary into a paper tape file that could then be read into the KIM-1, and sure enough, I was cheerfully greeted by the memory size prompt of Microsoft's earliest BASIC. Once I had it booting BASIC, I wanted to write some graphics routines for the graphics board. And while I've done my share of hand-coded 6502 in recent years even, I decided that in this case, I was going to port a C compiler known as CC65 over to the KIM-1. So once I had that working, I wrote a series of primitives that included the ability to render screen text using the Commodore PET ROM font. I also added lines and circles all in pure integer code that seemed to compile pretty efficiently. At least for a KIM-1, it seemed pretty fast. I recently got a line on a pair of working 8-inch floppy drives, so I'm going to grab those if possible, and I want to do two things. First, I want to get my MSI booting CPM off the real floppies, and then I want to get my original Altair booting and running off floppy as well. I also just recently got Zork up and running on my PDP-1123, which may be worthy of an episode, but is there an audience for such retro shenanigans? Well, at almost 500,000 subscribers, there seems to be at least a little appetite for it. And as long as there is, it'll keep giving me a valid excuse to keep on buying weird, old, cool hardware, fixing it up, and showing it off. There's the PDP. Years ago, there was a guy on my team at Microsoft named Gary. Gary was a fair bit older than I was, and he was an industry hire coming over from Apple, or so I heard. He was a quiet and unassuming fellow, and over the course of the next few months of lunches in the cafeteria, we talked about things he had worked on in the past, and that's when little details started to emerge. You see, Gary had also worked at Xerox PARC before Apple, and while Gary was at Xerox, he had done a few cool things, like that time that he invented the laser printer in 1969. Oh, and it turns out that he'd done some other stuff I'd heard of, like digital effects on a movie called Star Wars. Ultimately, Gary would go on to receive several awards and distinctions, one of which was an Academy Award for his work at Pixar. I teased him that he should keep it in his office on the center of his desk, as he'd pretty clearly have the only one. He said they'd give out the technical Oscars on a different night with no fanfare, no red carpet, and no acceptance speeches. That makes any opportunity to speak about a technical career all the rarer, and for that, I'm deeply indebted to you for your time today. And I want to thank you all for coming out. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Usually the MacBook gets a laugh at these Microsoft talks, too. Any questions? Oh, yes.
Did you ever work on OS2?
I didn't. I came right in at the tail end. They had just kind of broken up the marriage between IBM and OS2 at the time. So we still had the OS2 subsystem, and we were maintaining it, but no new dev on it. Yes? 737? No, just kidding. I'm in Sammamish, Washington. Wait. Okay, so I'm just a little bit north of you there.
Yeah, I worked on Windows communications from 92 to 2000.
Oh, cool. We would have overlapped then.
And I teach engineering at UW.
Oh, that's very cool. What's your name, sir?
Jordan here, I'll give you a card.
Okay. Yes, in the back.
First of all, nice speech, mate.
Thank you.
What's your best guide and or Bulma story?
Sorry, I missed the last part.
What's your best Gates or Bulma story?
Well, I was out driving between buildings on campus, And I had just got a brand new Eagle Talon TSI all-wheel drive turbo. As you can tell from the long name, I was pretty excited about it. So I was booting through campus, and I came up on a crosswalk, and a guy walked into the traffic. And so I pounded on, I didn't squeal brakes, but I like skidded to a hard stop, and he kind of looked at me, and I looked at him, and it was Bill. And made sure that I did not see him for a while, so he did not recognize me. I also, as a bomber story, I think my favorite one is that he is incredibly brief in email. I got this long email chain about the registry and how it works and why it works that way and so on. And then I wound up getting forward to me, and his only comment was PLS XPLN. Please explain. Yes.
Can you speak anything about, or do you have any knowledge of or experience with Windows 2000 Pro port to Alpha?
A little bit, yeah, I would have worked on that.
Yeah.
I debugged stuff on it for sure, yeah.
Was that leaked or like how?
No, it was commercially available, wasn't it?
No,
The betas were, and it didn't make the final release?
it didn't make final release.
So was there ever NT351 supported Alpha for sure?
All I know is about a leaked beta for 2000 Pro for Alpha.
Okay, so yeah, they had it in 3.5.1, they had it in 4.0, and then when they got to Windows 2000, it sounds like they canceled it before it got to
Yeah.
ship. But there may be betas, the code probably exists for sure.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Hi. So I was also diagnosed on the spectrum late in life, and I also work in tech. I'm curious to know how has being on the spectrum helped you in your career, and how has it made it more difficult?
Okay, I think the biggest benefit is at least the obsessive approach that you can bring to problem solving, where you solve problems in the bathroom, you solve them at the dinner table, you solve them because you're always thinking about that thing you were working on. And I think that's kind of a weird attribute, but it comes in really handy. So some of the thought patterns lend themselves really well to programming and engineering and problem solving. In terms of the biggest drawback, they have to be social and managerial, especially because I didn't know that I had autism, so I didn't know that the way I was a little different from other folks. And so I was immune to, I was blind to certain things like blunt communication and candid feedback when it wasn't needed and stuff like that I would do and kind of had to figure out later.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
You're welcome.
I love your video about the Mac 10, and I want to ask you, is the OS 2 for Mac 20 the worst Microsoft product ever?
Well, I'd wager it's not the worst product ever. It's probably the worst selling product. I think that's the claim I've heard. And I think Raymond Chen said that. What happened was they sold something like 16 copies of the Mach 20 for the 286, and 10 of them were returned, so the net sales were 6.
Anybody else? Well, I have one. So being a programmer versus a hardware engineer has certain rewards, I'm gathering. I'm just setting you up for the age-old programmer versus hardware engineer. So that was it. I want to thank you for coming. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to introduce you correctly or anything. Everybody, let's big round of applause for Dave Plummer.